holy. First Jewish-owned real estate in the world, even before Miami or Brooklyn. Great to be back with you guys again here in Jerusalem. We're preparing for another extreme lockdown. We've been on a lockdown third round. Now they're going to make it more extreme. It's just so exciting. The good news is I'm getting my COVID shot tomorrow, round 1. So hopefully I'll be back next week unless I grow a third arm out of my head or something like that. Any unforeseen side effects. Anyway, hopefully we'll all get out of this soon because I think we've all had enough. Absolutely. At least you guys are in a state where I think you still have some things open. Not sure everywhere else is the same, but I'm looking forward to flying at some point. I've been in Israel now longer than I've been in about 30 years, over a year straight, which I usually fly about 6 times a year out of here. Anyway, enough about that. We're continuing with our series, The Jew in the Modern World. Hopefully you guys saw the previous class. If not, as you heard from Rabbi Moskowitz, classes are online, but each class stands on its own. So you don't have to, it's not important that you've seen the previous class. So that definitely helps give a little context. As always, I am going to attempt to share my screen. There it is. Let's try the advanced version. Let's see if this one's going to work. Let's see, I always have fun doing this and trying to find the right presentation. If not, we'll go back to the other one. World Perfect PowerPoints. Let's see if we can do this. Okay. Sorry, guys, just 1 second. There it is. Okay, here we go. Just give us 1 second. I like this because I get to be in the front of the screen down below as opposed to a little box on the side. Okay, so last week's class, we talked about the Enlightenment and its impact on the Jewish people insofar as we had to face a new threat in that now we were dealing with a non-Jewish world that was being nice to us and liking us and letting us out of ghettos and letting us go to universities and be doctors and lawyers and all the things we couldn't do. And as we saw in the last class, this proved to be a huge challenge for us, the Jewish people. So today I'd like to go into like the continuation of that, not only chronologically, but also in terms of taking that idea to the next step, because last week was kind of a cliffhanger. We just looked at this issue of how we deal with modernity, how we maintain our Jewish identity while at the same time trying to engage in a larger world that is now welcoming us into it. Again, we all living comfortably, whether it's in Boca or, well, Israel's a Jewish state, so it's not really fair, but New York, wherever you are, we now see that it's very possible to be a fully engaged Jew and a totally loyal and engaged citizen of the United States. But again, this was not something that we had figured out from the beginning, and there's a big learning curve involved. And this class is really going to deal with a very important lesson. We're going to focus primarily on the Reform movement in Germany. This is not a class about the Reform movement today, really. It's more about the history of it, because we can learn some very important lessons. We'll also talk a little about the conservative movement and the reaction to those movements from the Orthodox world. Lots of interesting stuff that we can learn from this whole process that is very relevant to us, our identity, and our continuity today. By the way, I personally was raised Reform. I am not they say, from birth, that expression, you're born religious. I say I'm really not a Baal Tshuva, I'm FFA, I'm from Aish. But I'm an Aish product for many, many years, still teaching there, almost going on 39 years later. But I actually was raised Reform in Temple Israel, New Rochelle. I even found some pictures of it online. I was very impressed. This is the new sanctuary. I was one of the first 3 kids bar mitzvahed in the sanctuary in 1972. So now you can figure out my age. But I was raised Old German Reform. This specific congregation was the second largest Reform congregation in North America. When I say Old German Reform, I'll explain that as we go. But in Temple Israel of New Rochelle, when I was there back in the day, if you entered the sanctuary wearing a kippah or a talit during the prayer service, they would actually ask you to take it off or leave. Now, I know that sounds kind of weird, but we're going to see where that came from. And that's not actually the situation fast forward till today, but it gives us some context. But the Reform movement actually begins, it's relatively speaking, a modern movement in Judaism. There have been offshoots of Judaism that go back much earlier. We have the Sadducees and we have Karaites and people that go back centuries, if not millennia. But the Reform movement actually begins first and foremost in Germany, and it comes out of a response to modernity. I showed you this little like, it's not really a graph, but this little chart last week of how the Jewish world responded. This is Western Europe. Next week's class, God willing, we're going to deal with Zionism, and it's more doing with Eastern Europe and the situation there, which is probably where most of you guys or your ancestors are from. The vast majority of Ashkenazic Jews' ancestry is not from places like Germany. It's from Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire. Although I have to say my family, Spiro, is originally from Speyer in Germany, but that was many, many hundreds of years ago. My father's grandparents came from Ukraine, from Kiev. But as you see in our little chart here, when we were let out of the ghettos, what was the reaction? We have TOs in the middle. Those are the Jews who just tried to remain with their Torah observance. But then we see we have a series of reactions moving to the left. One of them will be the Reform movement. Now you see the most extreme reaction, of course, will be conversion. Jews, for whatever reason, usually, as we saw in the last class, not so much because they suddenly realized that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, but much more out of trying to get past the barriers that still existed in even enlightened Europe. So that's the most extreme reaction. We had Jews who basically were just secular, meaning they didn't convert, but they didn't really in any way maintain any connection to the Jewish world, just completely, Jewish in name alone. And the Reform movement. The Reform movement came out of a desire to try and create a version of Judaism that would allow Jews to maintain some level of Jewish identity while fully engaging in European society. And it specifically began in Hamburg, Germany. Now remember, Germany in the 19th century was probably, in almost every single aspect, the most advanced country in Europe. Maybe not in fine arts, but certainly in science, in terms of a sophisticated democracy, technology, culture. Jews love Germany. It's one of the greatest love relationships. I know it sounds weird post-Holocaust, but Jews were gaga over Germany and how efficient and hardworking it was. And it actually was initially an incredible symbiotic relationship when Jews were let out of the ghettos. Jews living in countries like Germany, where the people are very driven and have, in the words of Max Weber, if you remember, he created the term the Protestant work ethic. Jews in that environment, like you being in a top school, you have to be on your A game to achieve. So it really pushed us to greatness. And it created an incredible amount of Jewish creativity, an incredible amount of Nobel Prizes coming out of virtually all the Nobel Prizes coming out of Germany pre-Nuremberg laws, 1933, were actually coming out of German Jews. It's an incredible story. I highly recommend a book. I'll say it now. I think it's on my website also, kenspiro.com. I have a bibliography, and one of the books that I really love, it's called The Pity of It All by Amos Elon, The Pity of It All. Fantastic story of the life for Jews in Germany from 1743 to 1933, from pre-emancipation, before Napoleonic Wars that we saw last week, till Hitler comes to power and the Nuremberg laws and Jews losing everything they had gained over the last 100 years or so in Germany. But the earliest Reform movement begins in Hamburg, Germany, 1811. Here you can see pictures of some of these beautiful synagogues they built, very Byzantine architectural style. And what we're going to do, by the way, for this class, I'm really going to bring in a lot of sources here, because I think it's very important. There's a great line that I think I mentioned before: not even God can change history, only historians can. But if you really want to be a little bit of an amateur historian, it's really important not to read books about what historians say about history, but to read the primary sources. Like, go to the actual documents. And for this specific class, we're going to look at a lot of documents, because what the founding fathers of the Reform movement say is far more insightful than me talking about it or some historian talking about it. And also what the pushback against the Reform movement from rabbinic personalities says is also extremely insightful. So we're going to look at a whole bunch of quotes that are taken primarily from the book, which is my favorite primary source book, I think I mentioned last week. It's called The Jew in the Modern World. And the editors are Pierre Mendes-Flohr and Yehuda Reinhardt's a fantastic book dealing with every major topic in modern Jewish history, bringing in tons of documents, really good stuff. But we're going to look at a series of quotes from the leaders of the Reform movement. Now, German Jews, who are also known as Yekas, when you think of Yekas, I don't know if you guys know any Yekas or if anyone of you are Yekas. I apologize, and I'm not insulting anyone here, I hope, but they're known for being very fastidious, exact, careful. It's like a German trait to be very careful and on time and precise, like the Swiss. So German Jews, German Reform movement, being German, kept very careful records of everything they did. And we now have access to those, and we can see what's going on in their heads, the internal thought processes. Here's the New Israelite Temple Association, Hamburg, December 1817. This is a mere 6 years after the founding of the movement. Now, by the way, the early Reform movement was not founded from scratch. It was converting. Before this time, there's nothing but orthodoxy. And we'll talk about that term later. But there's nothing but Orthodox shuls in Germany. So the earliest Reform shuls, before they will found their own congregations, will be converted. Literally, the buildings will be transformed. It's a gradual process that will take place primarily in the 19th century. Here's the worship service shall be conducted on Sabbath and holidays. Specifically, there shall be introduced at such a service a German sermon and choral singing to the accompaniment of an organ. It shall apply to all those religious customs which are sanctified by the church. Interesting. So first of all, let's go through the quote a little more carefully. Number one is, by the way, conducted on Sabbath. One of the innovations of the Reform movement will be to move the Sabbath to Sunday in many Reform congregations, including Temple Emmanuel in New York. One point we'll do that, which is on Fifth Avenue. The idea being what? That if we want to fit into the larger German society, we need to have the same holy day. We need to be coming out of our houses of worship at the same time as our German Protestant and Catholic neighbors are doing it. But German sermon as opposed to what language? And people say Hebrew, no. It's actually Judendeutsch, German Jewish, which is very similar, by the way, to Yiddish. But we need to be speaking the same language. We can't be speaking. Remember, Jews in almost every place in the world developed their own language that was a sub-language of the larger culture, usually based on the larger culture's language. Sephardic Jews had Ladino, which was based on 14th century Castilian Spanish. Yiddish was largely German with a lot of Hebrew and a little bit of Russian thrown into it. I even met, when I did the army many years ago, I was in reserve duty with a guy from Cochin, India. You know, when he's Cochin, dark, looked like an Indian guy. And he spoke a special dialect of Hindi that only the Jews of Cochin spoke. We got to fit in. What's with the choral singing and the organ? Remember in Temple Israel in the Rochelle, I remember we had an organ. It was behind a screen, but there's big pipes in the front of this congregation. The choir, by the way, I remember in Temple Israel was mostly these black kids I went to high school with who sung. We had our service on Saturday, actually, but they sung in their church on Sunday. And they sung for us on Saturday. It was interesting. But the idea was we need to make not just our day of worship, but our mode of worship has to be as similar to the larger German culture, the Christian culture. By the way, almost all the organ players early on were not Jews. It wasn't because of a Sabbath prohibition. We'll see the Reform movement is not going to be so much into that, but it was rather that Jews didn't know how to play organ. It was a Christian skill that they had honed over many, many centuries playing in churches. Now, it's interesting, the whole thing about sanctified by the church. It wasn't that the Reform movement is following like the Pope or something like that, but the overall theme is we have to fit in as much as possible. Now here, so there's some organs, by the way. You can see this is Temple Emmanuel in New York. That's quite a set of pipe organ. Ironically, when I became religious, I went back and I went to a Young Israel in New Rochelle, which was originally they bought before they built the new building. It was also in a converted church, and they had a pipe organ in the front, which wasn't used anymore. But I remember walking in and thinking, that's interesting. An Orthodox synagogue with a big pipe organ in the front of it. Okay, this is Reform Rabbinic Conference. We're fast forwarding a little further ahead in time from 1817 to 1844. Naphtali Frankfurter, which means his family's from Frankfurt, Germany, one of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe. He says, for Judaism, the principle of human dignity is cosmopolitan, meaning it's universal, right? But I would like to put proper emphasis on the love of particular people among whom we live and its individual members. As men, we love all mankind. That's a very, remember, we talked about the Enlightenment ideas. We saw, Schiller's song, Ode to Joy, all dimension Werte Bruder, all men are brothers. That's a very Enlightenment concept, the universality of mankind. But as Germans, we love Germans as children of the fatherland. We are and ought to be patriots, not merely cosmopolitan. Meaning, this universal idea of Judaism is very nice. The Reform movement has made a big, big deal out of that, absolutely, which is why it's interesting. I learned all these songs growing up Reform, and then when I actually got more knowledgeable Jewishly studying in yeshiva, I looked where they're all from, and overwhelmingly, they're from the book of Isaiah, which is the most universalistic, inclusive of all the prophets, talking about lambs lying down with lions and the brotherhood of humanity. But they're saying it's not just enough to be universalistic, which is that kind of general principle of enlightened Western European civilization. We have to be able to show our loyalty to Germany itself. And the euphemistic term for Germany is going to be the word fatherland. And you guys are going to see that word coming up all the time. So you see a desire not just to fit into a larger non-Jewish culture, but a desire to show loyalty to Germany itself and prove that Jews are loyal citizens. Since we're being offered loyalty, remember Napoleon? We talked about 1806 and 1807 in the last class, basically checking out, can you Jews be loyal to France? Do you put French law and loyalty to France above loyalty to your own people and following your own laws? So here they're making a clear choice that we have to be fully engaged and show our loyalty to the larger German culture. Here's Reformer Rabbinic Conference a year later, Frankfurt, 1845. By considering Hebrew as being of central importance to Judaism, moreover, one would define it as a national religion because a separate language is a characteristic element of a separate nation. Let's hit the pause button for just a second. Is that a true or false statement? A separate language is a characteristic element of a separate nation. The answer is basically yes. I mean, multiple countries can speak the same language, like England and America both speak English, although Churchill is known to have said the British and Americans have everything in common but language. But generally speaking, it's part of national identity, of land, language, and history. So that first part of the statement is basically correct. But look what they say now. But no member of this conference would wish to link Judaism to a particular nation. So here you could see the first radical reform of the Reform movement is taking Jews away from being, and what are Jews? I think we talked about this possibly before. Are we a religion, a race, a nation, a people, a family, a culture? We're not just a religion, and like being a Christian, we're also a nation. We have a land, a language, and a history. We're not a race, by the way. Anyone can join the Jewish people. We come in all size, shapes, and colors. But we understand that we're an ethno-religion. We have a country, we have a history. Okay, we've been scattered around the world. The Reform movement is making a radical change in Jewish identity. We're just a religious community. Because if we're saying we're a separate nation, what's their fear? We're going to be telling the Germans, we're not really German, we're really Jewish. We're like an ethnic group amongst you. Reform actually will change. They say we're not Jews, we're Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. Remember we talked about in the last week's class, if you stop a guy on the street and stick a microphone in his face, a Jewish guy, and say, please describe yourself with a bunch of adjectives. Anyone who is probably an Orthodox Jew, the word Jew will come out within the first couple of words. It might come out the first word. I'm a Jewish American, I'm a Jewish man, I'm a Jew, whatever. But here we're saying we are Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. And what they will drop, by the way, from the prayer book, besides writing it in German, they'll drop Hebrew. So Hebrew will be dropped from the prayer book, and any references to Israel, going back to Israel, Jerusalem, redemption, rebuilding the temple, they would say things like, we're not going back to Israel. Germany is our Israel. And Berlin or Hamburg or Frankfurt, that's our Jerusalem. And again, when you read this stuff post-Holocaust World War II, it sounds like, but you have to appreciate this was all, this is our looking back perspective on it. But when you say things like that, that's a radical change. We're not going anywhere. We are here to stay in Germany. We want to be part of the German people. That is going to be our primary identity. Fast forward to the next week's class, by the way, we talk about Zionism. You'll see that the Reform movement will be staunchly, initially anti-Zionist, precisely because Zionism is making this statement that we got to go back to Israel. It's not a religious issue for them. It's like a nationalist thing. Initially, that was the position of the Reform movement, which will carry on, by the way, all the way through until post-Holocaust. Then the Reform movement will much more become actively engaged with the state of Israel and much more into the idea of being pro-Zionistic. Of course, the state of Israel doesn't come into existence until after the Holocaust, but then the attitude will change dramatically. But here you could see a very dramatic shift in what is Jewish self-identity. We are purely a religious community. The two most important personalities of the Reform movement in Germany in the 19th century, these two gentlemen you see here. One is named Samuel Holtheim, and the other is named Abraham Geiger. And if you study, I remember when I was, going to my after-school Hebrew school classes, we learned all about these guys. Holtheim, I could say, is arguably the most radical modern Jewish thinker to call himself a rabbi. He wrote this book here, The Autonomy of the Rabbis, in which he advocates the dropping of the vast majority of halacha, of Jewish law, as being irrelevant to modernity. Which brings us into the next issue. The Reform movement has already dealt, the early Reform movement, with the idea of national identity. We're not a people, we're a religious community, but that brings us into the whole issue of how relevant is Jewish lifestyle and halacha to modernity. So look at this. This is Holtheim right here. This is Reform Rabbinic Conference, Frankfurt, 1845. Again, this is less than half a century after the founding of the movement. The hope for national restoration, which means, again, this is pre-Zionism, but the hope, remember, going to Israel, it predates Zionism by thousands of years. God tells Abraham, Lech Lecha, you go. So we've always known we're supposed to be there. The hope for national restoration contradicts our feelings for the fatherland. There's the word again. Meaning, if we say we're going to go to Israel, what are we telling the Germans? We're only sojourning here, strangers in a strange land. We're not meant to be here long term. The wish to return to Palestine. I remember, this is not a political thing. It's nothing to do with the Palestinians. This is what Jews in Israel before 1948 were called Palestinians, and the Arabs were called Arabs. But that's the real estate was called Palestine. The wish to return to Palestine in order to create their political empire, meaning a new Jewish state, is superfluous. But Messianic hope, truly understood, is religious, and he's right. He's 100% right. The Messianic concept is not merely about a physical return to Israel, it's about a spiritual return. This latter religious hope, meaning this traditional religious idea, can be renounced only by those who have a more sublime conception of Judaism, a more profound conception, and who believe that the fulfillment of Judaism's mission is not dependent on the establishment of a Jewish state. The future of us is not to go back to Israel, but rather by the merging of Jewry into the political constellation of the fatherland, by Jews merging with Germany. Only an enlightened conception of religion can replace a dull one. This is the difference between strict orthodoxy and reform. Both approach Judaism from a religious standpoint, but while the former, meaning those Orthodox guys, aim at the restoration of the old political order, meaning Israel, the latter, us reform, aims at the closest possible union with the political and national union of our times. So again, we see a very strong restatement of the notion of rejection of traditional Jewish connection to Israel and Jerusalem, to rebuilding the temple. By the way, Reform congregations called their buildings temple. I went to Temple Israel of New Rochelle, and it was deliberately done. Traditionally, Jews only had one idea of a temple. That was the building in Jerusalem, which was destroyed already since the time of the Romans in the year 70. By saying our sanctuaries are temples, we're saying that this is where we're meant to be. Remember, Germany, Berlin, Hamburg, that's our Jerusalem. So, but you see that there's a rejection coming from a guy like Holtheim, who's one of the most important influential thinkers, is a rejection of almost all halacha as being irrelevant. And we'll see this restated in just a couple more minutes when we move to the United States, where the Reform movement will move after. But again, a total rejection of old school Judaism. The Reform movement is what gives Torah observant Jews the name Orthodox. It's actually a derogatory term created by the Reform movement to make Jews who keep Torah look ossified, petrified, backward, constricted. Meaning Reform has has a movement, sounds much more in keeping with moving forward and progress. By the way, the Reform movement today calls themselves the World Union of Progressive Judaism, because that sounds even more forward moving. The notion that we have to free ourselves of this dinosaur-like restrictions and self-identity that comes from orthodoxy and the obsession with halacha, and move into a more modern conception of what Judaism is about that is much more in keeping with the view of a modern world and enlightened cultures like Germany. Otherwise, we're doomed. It's not going to work for us. So you see, this is pretty radical stuff. Now, what's interesting is when you put it all together, by the time you get to the mid-19th century, if Judaism is both a nation and a religion, what we see the Reform movement has done within 50 years of establishing itself is reject pretty much both of these concepts of, when I say religion, not that we're not a religion, but the observance side of religion. Okay, we're a religious community, but observance is all irrelevant. Kashrut, Shabbat, things like that, we don't need that. And certainly national identity, absolutely don't need that at all. Now, it's, you know, if the Reform movement, if the leaders of the Reform movement, and they, by the way, will largely seize control. In a city like Frankfurt, the Reform movement will become the majority of the Jewish community and seize control of the local Jewish councils. In places like Germany, the German authorities would allow the Jews to run their own internal affairs. Had the Reform movement in Germany in the mid-19th century just let the Jews, the Orthodox community, go on and do their own thing, it would have been a very different story. Now, this, you're probably wondering what this little image I created for you here is. I remember when I did anthropology when I was in high school, we had this tree of the evolution of modern Homo sapiens sapien. That's us there at the top, the guy in the middle with the beard there. Okay, remember this stuff? Homo erectus, Homo habilis, you know, Neanderthal, Australopithecus africanus. We know that according to anthropology, right, you get to modern man, there are all kinds of offshoots. What happened to all these guys? Where is Neanderthal man? I had a neighbor next door to me when I lived in Givat Zev. I think was probably descended directly from this guy based on how he behaved. But generally, anthropologists would say that these guys couldn't adapt, so they died out. So had the Reform movement's leadership, you know, in the mid-19th century said, you Orthodox Jews, you're ossified, you're just stuck in the past, like that's over there. You're just going to go down the road to extinction, but you know, we believe that you can go the way you want to go and, you know, do your thing, and we'll see who turns out being right. But we see is often a case in Judaism when Jews leave Judaism behind. You'll see this in the Hanukkah story, by the way, very clearly. When a bunch of small but influentially powerful bunch of Jews decide to become Greek first, for a lot of different reasons, which is probably a double PhD thesis in psychology, sociology, and maybe even history. When Jews leave Judaism behind, those Jews who stay connected to Judaism really bother a lot of them. Possibly for two reasons. I'm just speculating here. One is when Chaim becomes Heinrich, but Shmuel stays Shmuel. Every time he walks out of his house and sees Shmuel, first of all, he feels guilty. Like, I'm moving away and he's still staying loyal. Or maybe, or he's thinking, you know, Horst, who's a real German, is going to look at Shmuel and look at me and think, you think I think you're Heinrich, but I know you're still Chaim because I look at Shmuel as your next door neighbor and you Jews are really all the same. But for whatever reason, without going more into it, we often find this is a case that when Jews leave Judaism behind, as many cases in history, like I said before, they're not happy to let their Jews who remain like connected to Judaism just keep doing their thing. They will often go after those Jews, and that's what's going to happen in Frankfurt. The Reform movement will not only seize control of the established Jewish infrastructure, but they will throw the Orthodox out of it. They will shut down the Jewish schools. They will shut down the kosher butcher. They will get the German authorities on punishment of fine or imprisonment to ban the teaching of like the Talmud and things like that. It's a very similar story to what happens in the Hanukkah story going back 2,000, almost 200 years ago, when Hellenized, Greekified Jews will sick the Greeks on their fellow Jews. And they managed to almost wipe out the Orthodox community of Frankfurt, one of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe. Into the fray will jump the man who decides to like basically take up the banner of orthodoxy, so to speak, and defend the Jewish people's relevance in Germany. And his name is Samson Raphael Hirsch. These two guys you see here, Azrael Hildesheimer and Hirsch, they're pretty much contemporaries of each other. These guys are, by the way, intellectually the fathers of what we call modern orthodoxy. And Hildesheimer, Azrael founded the first sort of yeshiva university in Germany. I personally believe it's counterfactual speculation, and we'll talk about this more in the next class. Had he been able to set up a whole network of yeshivas throughout Europe, I think a lot more Jews would have stayed religious, because he offered the first yeshiva learning experience that had a secular learning program along with it, which is something was unheard of in yeshivas, something you see today in Yeshiva University today. But Hirsch was the chief rabbi of Moravia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He had a large congregation, a 50,000 member community. He left that very prestigious rabbinic community to go back to Frankfurt to lead the counterattack, not a physical counterattack, but the ideological defense of orthodoxy. Just like Saadia Gaon will do, going back to the 9th century, the Common Era, when the Karaism was threatening, if you're familiar with that movement, was threatened to overwhelm mainstream Judaism. Saadia Gaon will lead the theological, philosophical counterattack, which is why I love Hirsch. Because even though he's been gone a long time, the issues he deals with are very much relevant to us today. If you've never read his stuff, I highly recommend it. Just get a good translation. Apparently, I do not speak German at all, but the people I know who speak German say he wrote beautiful, beautiful German. Very poetic. He's very philosophical, very deep thinker. And what does Samson Raphael Hirsch say? And this is the most important quote, I think, of the whole class, because he's speaking to us today, guys. Now, what is it that we want? Are the only alternatives to abandon religion or to renounce all progress? This is a zero-sum game, he's saying. It's either be orthodox or be in the world. We declare before heaven and earth that if our religion demanded that we should renounce what is called progress, we would obey unquestioningly, because our religion for us is the word of God, before which all other consideration has to give way. So he says, if it's a matter of being in the greater world or religious, we are sticking to the Judaism. There is, however, no such dilemma. Judaism never remained aloof from true civilization and progress. In almost every era, its adherents were fully abreast of contemporary learning and very often excelled their contemporaries. This, by the way, is a statement that is lost on much of the Orthodox world today, but is 100% correct. If you go back, 500-600 years, especially when Jews were in Spain, the Golden Age of Spain, you'll find that some of the greatest minds, like Maimonides, the Ralbag, Gershonides, it's unbelievable how Rabbi Zacuto, Abraham Zacuto, some of the greatest minds in cartography, in navigation, in astronomy, in mathematics, in medicine, in science, were the biggest rabbis. This, unfortunately, is something that the Jewish world has kind of lost as a byproduct of modernity. And we'll talk about that more in the next class for sure. He said, Judaism never remained aloof from true civilization and progress. In almost every era, its adherents were fully abreast of contemporary learning and very often excelled their contemporaries. Again, a very true statement. That Jews could be great Renaissance thinkers, not necessarily in the period of the Renaissance, but in terms of fully engaged in modern science and thinking, yet maintaining an incredibly high level of Torah observance and scholarship. An excellent thing is Torah combined with the ways of the world, which is Torah and derech eretz, as he says in Hebrew. In truth, if only most Jews were truly Jews, most of the factors would disappear, which today bar many an avenue of activity to them. And Hirsch is speaking to us today, guys. He's saying, it's not a zero-sum game. You can be fully engaged in the world and be a fully engaged, observant Jew. But what he is saying to us, which is the lesson we have to hear, is it's all a matter of priorities. Like if my son has to be the greatest neurosurgeon on the planet, he's got to go to Andover, this WASPy private school, and Harvard undergrad, and Yale Medical School, the chance of me having statistically Jewish grandchildren is very small. But if I felt my son or daughter first to be strong, positive, engaged Jews, and I make sure I invest in an excellent Jewish education and have them living in a great community where there is, opportunities to learn and be involved with other Jews who are similarly inclined. And okay, if they're going to go to university, they go to one that has a strong Jewish community, what activities or something like that, then you can have both. By the way, modern Orthodoxy has proven in hindsight, again, we have a lot of advantage over Hirsch and Hildesheimer. It hasn't been as easy to do as it says. there's a tremendous attrition rate in the modern Orthodox world today. I've had students in my classes in ancient Torah who are former day school guys who tell me that they're the only members after they're like 19, 20 years old, that they're the only kids who remain Shomer Shabbat in their day schools after they left. And that's an interesting question as to why. I think a lot has to do with a lack of a really strong infrastructure for that community and a lack of really good role models to show us how to do both. So in theory, but this is really the sort of the thinking of Yeshiva University, whose motto is Torah Umada, Torah and science and knowledge, and not Torah and Derech Eretz, but it's a similar concept. But what he's really, again, getting to, and this we got to think about, is this question of the priorities again. And as we'll see, and we'll talk about this more in the next class than this class, but today we have a Jewish world that is very much split down the middle, where the vast majority of Jews are very much not engaged or completely into modernity at the expense of their Jewish lifestyle, whereas you have a small but highly intense community of the ultra-Orthodox world of today, whether it's in Israel or scattered around the world, which lives in a very insular environment, is 100% engaged in the world of Torah. So we don't really have anything in the middle. But again, it's not one or the other. In theory, what Hirsch is telling us is you can go down the middle. Challenging, but doable. But he said the top priority has to be, first and foremost, a commitment to Torah and Jewish lifestyle. Okay, I even put up there some more images. You can see some, here we got the Rambam and got Gershonides. I thought it was very funny. I found these images here. Some Nachal Haredi soldiers over here. That's my daughter. There she is. You can see she's a mother of four and an adult oncology nurse at Tel HaShomer Hospital. I'm showing off my kids. And that is my son, who's an emergency room nurse at Shaarei Tzedek. There he is working the Corona ward. And there's Ben Shapiro, of course. So I thought that was cute. But the idea is you can do this. And in Israel, I think it definitely is something that is much more common that you see happening. Unfortunately, by the way, you'll notice there are very few, I've noticed as a little side, but there are very few Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, etc., who were raised in the ultra-Orthodox world. The ones I know who are ultra-Orthodox were raised in the mono-Orthodox world and went that way later, but you don't get that merger of those two worlds anywhere near the way you used to, especially not outside the land of Israel. Okay, now in addition to, let me just go back for a minute before we get to the quote. In addition to Hirsch trying to be that guy in the middle, the TO line, staying like in the center, you know, we say in physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You know, that's the principle behind jet propulsion. You know, the engine pushes that way and the plane goes that way. And we see the Jewish world the modern Jewish world especially is very much a byproduct of reaction. So as much as the Jewish world is moving to the left, so to speak, on that chart, reform movement, secular, and even conversion, a chunk of the Orthodox world out of what is perceived as not physical threats as much as spiritual threats, be it from offshoots of mainstream Judaism, or as we'll see in the next class, you know, communism, Buddhism, secular Zionism, which is taking Jews away from Jewish observance, will move to self-ghettoize and not necessarily build the physical walls, but build up barriers to keep that world out in the hope of trying to preserve Jewish lifestyle. One of the founders of what we call, and by the way, this is such an interesting point, and people need to understand me on this clearly, what we call the ultra-Orthodox world of today is also a new version of Judaism. Okay, when I say new version, I'll explain that in a few minutes, but it's not something you have had for centuries in the Jewish world. I'll explain as we go along. And one of the founders of this new version of Torah-observant Jews is Rabbi Moses Shriver, the Khatam Sofer. He's famous for his famous statement, Chadash min Torah asur. It's taken from the Bible. Chadash is the new grain that you can't, you know, after Pesach, you can't eat it until you do the offering of the Omer, which is what we count, but he's making a play on words. It also means new. He doesn't mean you can't have new technology. He means that innovation, and the reason why he specifically focuses on this is because early reform movement, as I mentioned before, was making small innovations in Orthodox congregations, which are going to lead to dramatic changes. So look what Khatam Sofer by Moses Schreiber says in 1819. This is only 8 years after the founding of the Reform movement. He says, don't touch the books of Rabbi Moses. He's talking about Mendelssohn of Dessau, and your foot will never slip. Never say times have changed. We have an old father who has never changed and will never change. The order of prayer and synagogue shall remain forever as it has been up to now, and no one may presume to change anything of its structure. Now, it's interesting what he says here. He's going after Mendelssohn. Now, Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn was one of the great minds of the Enlightenment, not just Jewish minds, but minds. He was a tremendous thinker. Immanuel Kant, who was one of the real great German Enlightenment philosophical thinkers, who was a personal friend of Mendelssohn, who was a hunchback, by the way. Immanuel Kant called Mendelssohn the Jewish Plato. That's pretty high praise, being called Plato by one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment. Now, Mendelssohn himself remained his entire life an observant Jew. He kept kosher, he kept Shabbat, but he was obsessed with the Enlightenment. Obsessed. And that obsession will move his descendants away from Judaism. Matter of fact, all of Mendelssohn's grandchildren will convert to Christianity. His grandson, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, the composer, is the greatest composer of church music in Europe in the 19th century. Leave it up to a Jew to do that, convert it to Christianity. But then again, why should we be surprised? What's the biggest selling song of all time in English? I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, and that's composed by Irving Berlin, who also wrote Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Anyway, a little bit of trivia for you. But he's saying a guy like Mendelssohn is really dangerous because Mendelssohn did the first modern German translation of the Bible. He said, don't be fooled by this guy. He may appear to be a religious Jew, but his real religion is a love of the enlightened culture. But he says, notice what he picks on here, the order of prayer. Again, at the time when the Hatam Sofer is writing this, these were the little innovations that the Reformer was making. They were taking the bima, which is traditionally in the middle of the synagogue, pushing it forward to the front of the synagogue like it was in Temple Israel. I went turning it around to face the congregation like in a church. The rabbi, remember in Temple Israel, the rabbi who didn't wear a kippah wore long black robes with a long white collar and these big sleeves. He looked like a Lutheran minister. It was these little things, but we see that little innovations in Judaism are like making small holes in a big dam, like you drill a hole in a dam, and initially a little bit of water trickles out. But because you've actually damaged the structural integrity of the dam, the little holes develop into cracks that develop into bigger cracks. And before long, as we see, the whole dam is going to get washed away. So he said, you can't do any of this stuff. Now, meanwhile, so we got to keep it like the way it is. He's going to build a wall. And this is really the founding ideology of what will become the Haredi ultra-orthodox world. So that's going to be our the ultra-orthodox response we see over on the line over here. Now, by the way, the reform movement is going to basically, here we have the ultra-orthodox world of today, by the way. Some pictures over here. These are interesting pictures. I did a little searching. This is students in the Hebron Yeshiva 100 years ago. These are the Hebron Yeshiva today. They all look like this now. Look at what they're wearing. They're wearing straw hats. No one has beards. These are Yeshiva students 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago. And you can see what it's developed into. This whole world of everyone dressing the same, looking the same, that kind of thing is again overwhelmingly really a post-World War II phenomenon. But now it's a massive community. The fastest growing Jewish community in the world is this ultra-Orthodox community, which is extremely conformist in its appearance. And although not necessarily its worldview, because there are many different streams, Hasidic and Misnagdid and Ashkenazic and Sephardic. But this is what it's evolved into, the ideology of today. Now, by the way, the reform movement, excuse me 1 second, the reform movement will, after Napoleonic Wars, there'll be a lot of political and economic instability in Germany, a lot of explosions of reaction to liberalism, which will also be, there'll be anti-Jewish riots in Germany in 1815 and things like that, in Bavaria, the Hep riots. And because of the economic and political instabilities, a lot of Reform Jews will move to the United States. The first great wave of immigration to America will be this wave. In 1776, there's about 2,000 Jews living in America, and most of them are Sephardic Jews. Many of them were escaping Spain and settled in the New World since the time of the expulsion in 1492 to get to religious freedom. 280,000 German Jews will come to America in the mid-19th century. They'll settle in Manhattan, founding places like Temple Emmanuel, which is this huge Looks like a Byzantine cathedral. It's architecturally on Fifth Avenue. Maybe some of you have seen it if you're from New York. The Upper West Side of Manhattan will be like the Dakota where John Lennon lived. That's a building built by Reformed Jews. That will be their suburbs of Manhattan, will be that area. And the center of the Reform movement will move from Germany, from places like Frankfurt to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Cincinnati, Ohio. And the leadership, some of them will move to America, but eventually America will end up with its own American-born rabbis. But the initial leadership of the Reform movement in America will be German Jewish rabbis who will transplant themselves to the United States. A great example is Isaac Mayer Weiss, who will create a whole, Stephen Weiss, his descendant, will be the most powerful Jew in America in the time of World War II. Close confidant of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Look what, now the Reform movement, look at the Pittsburgh platform of 1885. When you're reading this, think of all the platforms we've read until now. How much does this sound like everything we've heard until now? We today accept as binding only the moral laws, meaning we don't hold by halacha. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet and dress originated in ages and under influences of ideas altogether foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither return to Palestine, nor sacrificial worship, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning a Jewish state. So guys, how much is this like everything we just saw? It's a beautiful one-paragraph restatement of everything Reform movement believed in for the half a century before. A rejection of halacha and a rejection of Jewish national identity and the notion of Jewish statehood. Okay, now, by the way, at the first graduating class of the first American ordained Reform rabbis, here you can see it's at the Highland House. Here is the menu. I got this menu from a book originally. It's called Critical Documents in Jewish History, another primary source book. It's actually edited by 2 Reform rabbis. I love these primary source books because not only do they have the documents, they also have the comments of the editors who happen to be 2 Reform rabbis. And look at the menu first, and I'll tell you the comments. It's quite humorous. Look what's on this menu. This is the first graduating class of American ordained rabbis, not the ones who came from Germany. We got little neck clams, shrimp salad, non-kosher meat, of course, grenouille, frog's legs, soft-shelled crab. The only thing missing from the menu is like pork. So it's funny, the rabbis writing this, the 2 Reform rabbis, one was a man, one was a woman, editor's comments on this menu. This is called the Treifa menu, the famous Treifa menu. Some say this is Reform movement's deliberate attempt to demonstrate its rejection of traditional Jewish dietary laws. Others suggest it was a catering error. I found that comment very funny. It was clearly the former, not the latter. By the way, at this dinner, a bunch of people at the dinner stood up and stormed out of the room. They said it's one thing to reject traditional Jewish dietary laws, but to be so in your face, milk and meat and frog's legs, all this stuff, and they go and found the conservative movement, which was founded as a reaction to the Reform movement that didn't want to go back to orthodoxy. They will bring in, we'll talk about it in just a minute, but let me show you the founding, the Constitution and bylaws of the Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Theological Seminary, in 1886, which is the first American created version of Judaism. And you can see there's the original, January 31st, 1886. The necessity having been made manifest for an association or organized effort on the part of Jews of America faithful to Mosaic law and ancestral traditions. You see the move away from rejection of halacha, the Reform movement, but back towards the more traditional point of view, for the purpose of keeping alive a true Judaic spirit, in particular by the establishment of a seminary where the Bible shall be impartially taught and rabbinic literature faithfully expounded, in accordance with the resolution adopted at the meeting of ministers held on Shvat, the 25th, 5646, whatever, agreed to organize the Jewish Theological Seminary. They will bring in this gentleman, Solomon Schechter, who is a British scholar from Cambridge University, who is in charge of that famous Cairo Geniza find in the synagogue in Cairo, where they found this Geniza that was never emptied out. They found at the bottom of it handwritten letters from Maimonides, cool stuff. They bring him in to run the movement That's why their day school movement is named Schechter. And there you can see the original JTS building in New York. Now, look what he says here. This is already, you see that in theory, in the bylaws sound like pretty rational, but then you see Schechter is a little more extreme in his worldview here. He calls the essay Catholic Israel already. That's already designed to get a rise. You can be sure. Catholic doesn't mean Christian, it means universal. But there's no question he picks that word, I'm sure, to like poke. He says it's not to be a revealed Bible that is of importance to the Jew, but the Bible as it repeats itself in history. In other words, as it is interpreted by tradition. Another consequence of this conception of tradition is that neither scripture nor primitive Judaism, but general custom which forms the real rule of practice. Liberty was always given to the great teachers of every generation to make modifications and innovations in the harmony with the spirit of existing institutions. Hence, a return to Mosaism would be illegal, pernicious, and indeed impossible. Now, this is already, you can see, he's drawing the line in the sand here. He's saying we're not the reform movement. We're going to go by, interpreting tradition, but according to our own standards, which is not a complete rejection of tradition, nor is it a reacceptance of orthodoxy, which he calls primitive Judaism. Now, by the way, this is a very disingenuous statement here. He says, liberty was always given, yes. In every generation, the rabbis had the ability to transmit, interpret, and apply law, but always between certain red lines that you never crossed. Like as to how kosher your meat had to be, so there's room for, debate, but you have to check the animal, you have to check there's certain things you got to do. You can't just say, eat any cow you like. By the way, the initial conservative movement, and I'm not here to rag on the conservative movement, but the initial conservative movement followed a very, a halachic process. One of my friends, Orthodox rabbi himself, his grandfather was the halachic posek for the conservative movement. He made their own Shulchan Aruch, their code of Jewish law, which I saw, which was actually quite a learned book, which based all of their psak halacha, their decisions on traditions that didn't necessarily go by the Orthodox, like regarding things like swordfish, when you can eat it because it's born with scales and loses it, and rennet, that the cheese is hardened by, you take it out of the marrow of the bones. Can it come from non-kosher animals, and the whole issue of milk and meat and all that. And they took liberal positions which the Orthodox world didn't hold by. By the way, the conservative movement, I would say the most consequential decision they made was about cars. When cars became prevalent in America post-World War II, the Orthodox looked at how a car works. Spark is lighting a fire, no car, unless it's pikuach nefesh, saving a life. The conservative movement said only cars for driving to synagogue. And what happened, I had a conservative rabbi say this to me. They said, when they said that, that means that conservative Jews then drove to everywhere but synagogue. That led to the dropping of keeping of Shabbat. As Max Nordau said beautifully, and he wasn't even religious, he said more than the Jews kept the Sabbath kept the Jews. And that was the beginning of the end of conservative adherence to halacha. Fast forward 100 years later, by the way, and there's very little that the average conservative Jew does more than a Reform Jew. And as we'll see in a couple of minutes, Reform has moved more to the right, and conservative Judaism is now, to today, moved more to the left. The only big difference between Reform and conservative today is a conservative rabbi will not do an intermarriage. They'll do a same-sex marriage, but not an intermarriage. They even have in the conservative Eitz Chaim their Bible, which is like the art scroll for the conservative movement. There is an essay by Chaim Potok, the famous author who wrote The Chosen and the Promise, which advocates adhering to what is called biblical criticism, which is the theory of the German Bible critic Julius Wellhausen, which calls into question the notion of a God-given written law, the Torah. So forget the whole interpretation of the oral law. It's an abandonment of pretty much everything. So sadly, we see that the small innovations, or conservative trying to stay in the middle, didn't really work itself out so well in practice. And I said there's very little difference between the Reform and conservative movement of today. Anyway, meanwhile, we have to move on here and get close to it. We're going to go a couple of minutes over, just a few, but I hope you'll bear with me because the end of this is really, really interesting. But we fast forward till actually, we're going to skip this over here. We're going to principles of Reform Judaism. I want to show you, this is reconstructist position. To save a little time, we're just going to go here. Let's go back to the Reform movement. The Reform movement was making an assumption that orthodoxy is doomed to failure. And I want to end with an analogy here that illustrates this. And this is really relevant to today. Oh my God, I made this presentation before COVID-19. But let's say, you want to introduce a vaccine for a disease. How does this work? Now, we're all familiar with this. Now, let's say you already have treatment A has already been proven, all long since proven by the FDA to work on disease X. And that's accepted. But you want to introduce B and you want to introduce C as new therapies or new surgical procedures. What is the FDA and the AMA going to demand of you? Clinical trials. You have 1,000 people, you do it for 10 years, okay? Now, let's say at the end of clinical trials, the patients who get like drug B and drug C are treated to the same level, the same efficacy as A, or even better. If they're better than A, you get rid of A, right? And you do B or C. If they're the same as A, you say you have a choice, patients, you can have A, B, or C. But what if, boom, all the, like here you have cured, and what if all the patients are dead from the new cure you're trying out 10 years later? Everyone recognizes it would be scientifically completely incorrect and immoral and unethical to continue to advocate treatment C as a cure for disease X. But that is more or less, with that kind of harsh analogy, that is more or less what we see happened. Like I say, history, my favorite quote from Lord Bolingbroke, the British lord of the 18th century, is history is philosophy with examples. As we saw when we looked at that evolutionary table, the reform movement in Frankfurt was saying, you Orthodox Jews, you are on a dead end. You're Neanderthal man, you're Cro-Magnon, you're going down the road to extinction because you're not going to adapt. We are Homo sapiens sapiens. We're the guys who are moving to the future. The exact opposite turned out to be the case. When Temple Emmanuel, which was established in 1845, had its centennial celebration, they could not find one Jewish descendant of the founding members of Temple Emmanuel, who's still Jewish. When the B'nai B'rith, which is the first secular modern Jewish organization founded in America, again, established in 1843, this is that big influx of German Jews, had their centennial, they could not find any Jewish descendants of the founding members. Because when you gut Judaism of its observance and its national component, you not only have nothing left really of substance, it doesn't keep Jews Jewish. Now, the most interesting part of all of this is a doctor, let me 1 second, hold on 1 second. It's basic exam for just a second. Oh, here it is, Richard Levy, 1 second before you look at it. Richard Levy, my apologies. Richard Levy, who is 3 or 4 leaders ago, the leader of the reform movement in the 1990s, the beginning of the 1990s, recognizing that the reform movement was hemorrhaging members. Temple Israel New Rochelle, by the way, where I was a member, had 1,500 families when I was there. We're talking about the late 60s, early 70s. Today, I think its membership is down 75%, and they rent out parts of the building to other organizations and daycare centers and everything. Richard Levy pushed through the 10 principles of Reform Judaism. I really looked online to try and find the cover of Reform Judaism's magazine. I couldn't find it, but it's an amazing cover. Compared to Holtheim and Geiger, there's Richard Levy on the cover, wearing a big kippah with a beard, wearing a talit, holding a prayer book that says Sidur on it in Hebrew, holding his tzitzit from his talit in his hand like he's doing Shema and kissing it. Now, the 10 principles, you can go to Reform Judaism's website and read them in detail, but here's the short version I'm going to show you now. As you look at these guys, I want you to think, how different is this from what the Reform movement was saying going back 100 years ago or more? Here it is, the 10 principles of Reform Judaism, which was was accepted barely by the leadership of the Reform movement, 1998. Created by the Holy One, we are seekers after God. Having stood at Sinai, respond to the call of mitzvot amid modernity. It's like we should be open to the idea. We were redeemed from Egypt to help repair the world. We are committed to Shabbat. We are committed to learning and seasonal celebrations. We are open to the expanding of the mitzvot of Reform Jewish practice. We are members of a holy people. Members of a holy people, we are rooted in a holy land. Members of a holy people, we are heirs to a holy tongue. We are committed to the equality of all people before God. Now, they threw in some of the social justice stuff, which is very big in the reform movement in general. But this is a 180. It's not like, guys, the experiment didn't work, let's go back to being observant Jews. But this is as far as the movement could go. It is huge. And it's the biggest lesson we have to learn from this, which is so incredibly important. This is not open for debate. It's not about ragging on reform movement or the conservative movement. It's just a fact that history shows what keeps Jews Jewish is Jews keeping Judaism. To the extent that you live and learn as a Jew is the extent, like we love to say in Eshet Torah, it doesn't matter whether your grandparents were Jewish, but whether your grandchildren will be Jewish. And therefore, we have to be investing in, which is why, by the way, one of the big beefs I have with spending so much money on Holocaust commemoration. Don't get me wrong, I think it's really important. But that's a lot of funds about the past, that millions of dollars spent on this stuff, like supporting the National Holocaust Memorial in Washington, which is an amazing museum, an incredible experience. But meanwhile, day school tuition is through the roof. That's the joke. And I'm sure a lot of you know what I'm talking about. The joke about what's the number one form of birth control for Orthodox Jewish parents is day school tuition. It's absolutely critical to us to recognize that the extent that we, and by the way, children, I always tell this when I'm guiding groups of people in Israel, I say, your kids do what you do, not what you say. You can't tell your kids, damn it, don't curse. If you curse, they're going to curse. You can't say to your kids, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I know you guys are all committed, but Judaism is really important. Then you don't do anything Jewish. On Saturday, you go play golf. You're probably not going to have grandchildren who are going to be Jewish. By the way, I think I made the point, but I got to show you the last quote. And we're basically at the end here. I just want to show you a graph at the end after that, but this is the last quote. This is from Eric Yoffe, who was 2 presidents ago the head of the Reform movement. Coming out of the head of the Reform movement, basically almost 200 years after the movement was founded, this is the statement that says it better than 100 Orthodox rabbis saying it. Look at this quote. But I suggest as a matter of personal belief and objective fact that only education rooted in commitment to God, Torah, and mitzvot will succeed. Nothing else in the 3,000-year history of the Jewish people has ever worked. Fact, coming from the head of the Reform movement, this is exactly the point, guys. And since you've been so patient and gone along, I got to show you one more thing here. This chart was created by 2 friends of mine, Anthony Gordon and Richard Horowitz. Richard Horowitz was at one point probably the biggest insurance salesman in the United States. He's a real bean counter. There's my pictures of Jewish commitment, living and loving a Jewish life. That's the inspirational picture there of living as a Jew and studying as a Jew. But look at this chart over here. This, by the way, this chart has been, I hope you can see it. I know it's a little hard to read, but I'll go through it with you just quickly. This chart has been published in every movement of Judaism's magazines. The Orthodox, the Reform and the Conservative movement have published this. These guys are bean counters. These are insurance guys. And look at this. It's amazing. Secular, Reform, Conservative, Centrist Orthodox, Hasidic, Haredi Orthodox. If you start out, imagine this is your money. Okay, this chart has been updated multiple times. You start with 100 Jews. What do you have 4 generations later? Secular Jews, you get 4 Jews. Intermarriage assimilation devastates them. The Reform movement, you end up 100 Jews, 13 Jews. Slightly less, but still devastating. Conservative, you have 52 Jews starting with 100. Centrist Orthodox, you got from 100, you got 337. Haredi, you start with 100, you got 3,398. A lot has to do, of course, with a very high birth rate, but incredible. But clearly you see, you can draw a strong dividing line between the Torah observant Jewish community and everyone else. The rest, it just statistically shows this does not preserve the Jewish people. And that so many Jews have disappeared since the Holocaust, not because they've been physically slaughtered, but opting out of Judaism, a combination of little or no affiliation, strong Jewish identity, combined with low Jewish birth rates, has devastated the Jewish people. But the lesson, guys, just to summarize, it's so important we learn from this is a great example. The whole history of the rise of the Reform movement and what went wrong with it in the end is a great illustration of how important it is to have Judaism, Jewish lifestyle, Jewish education is a central priority in our lives. And if we make that commitment individually with our families, personally, of course, and as communities, and invest in that, then we have a bright Jewish future. And that is the real lesson of this class. Thank you very much for joining me yet again. There's my website where you can access a lot of my content online. I have a lot of other classes, detailed classes on Jewish history and many other topics that we're not going to be covering. It's been a pleasure. Everyone should have an excellent rest of the week. Stay healthy. And I will be back next week with a really interesting last class of the Jew in the Modern World, which is on Zionism and Judaism. Is there a conflict there? You know, convergence and divergence, I call it. You're welcome to contact me through the website, which, by the way, I love to get feedback from people. If you have questions, comments, I would love to hear them. I hope you enjoyed the class, and everyone have a great afternoon. And I am now going to end my show.